I'm Danielle Nierenberg. For those of you who don't know, I am president and co-founder of Food Tank. It is my sincere pleasure to have you all here at Huston Tillotson University to see this wonderful film gather. And I am so honored to be joined by A-dae Romero-Briones from the First Nations Development Institute, who's a producer on the film, and the filmmaker and director himself, Sanjay Rawal. Another round of applause. So, I hope you will all stay for this discussion because I see people leaving. I hope you'll sit back down. I think this is such an important film and such an important conversation to have, and I couldn't be happier that it's here at South by Southwest as an official part of the program. It's really amazing, and it's about time. So, A-dae and Sanjay, I think the first question is kind of an obvious one and maybe a naive one, but why did you both think that this film had to be made?
Well, I don't think we realized that people would actually watch it. I think in terms of your question, there are some amazing and beautiful things happening in Indian country. The time is right in terms of the socioeconomic landscape in Indian country for there to be this sort of rejuvenation or revitalization of entire systems. But as A-dae will speak to much more deeply than I ever will be able to, like this wisdom has always existed. So it's not like we're trying to capture a movement, but there's a very special moment that's going on right now. So we approached it just for the sake of the archives, so that people in the future, once the communities regained their food sovereignty, could look back at these years and see some of the pillars, not all, just a handful of the pillars that are really doing the work.
That's great. I love that you're capturing this moment in time. It is historical what's happening. It's very important to really capture that and make sure that others know it. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah. Part of the reason for First Nations.
Thank you.
Yes, it's an important time in history when we think about food systems. You know, we have all these conversations about organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, permaculture. There's so many conversations happening. And we were often at First Nations, because all we do is work with indigenous food and agricultural projects, we're always getting approached by people asking us, can you explain the indigenous food movement? And it would agitate me to no end, because a movement assumes there's a beginning and an end. We have always been here. We will be here after, when all these conversations end. And so I needed, like a deep part of me needed to show people that this is more than just one conversation in a moment in time. We're timeless, and our generations are going to be timeless. And that's how we need to approach food systems, because, you know, thinking about consumers and producers limits the way we understand our relationship with the land and each other and the world. And so this was our attempt to try to get some of those stories out there. And I have to say we failed, because there are so many indigenous food stories out there that need to be put on film, that need to be put in front of people, that, you know, I hope Sanjay and I work on more projects.
There's a young woman that we just met named Alex. Alex, can you wave? An Inuit filmmaker. There's how many hundreds of tribes in Alaska? Almost as many in Alaska as there are in the lower 48. And she's beginning a film on trying to capture Inuit food traditions.
No, and that's amazing. Sanjay, what advice, because, you know, how did you approach working with indigenous communities and getting in there and then sort of, you know, not just focusing on one family or one tribe, but really like seeing what the landscape was? What advice would you give to other filmmakers who are looking to, you know, start this and tell these stories or help share these stories?
Well, what I was told at the beginning, it's a very important question, was that there are some topics that non-natives shouldn't even approach. And non-natives won't know what those topics are. And there are some topics that non-natives can approach. And the question is, as a non-native, how do you know which topics to approach? Well, you have to already have friends in Indian country, and maybe you need to approach the community as a friend in the spirit of service. And if somebody wants to work with you, that's your entry into the community. That said, with this project, it was really the genesis of the First Nations Development Institute. You know, we had a big scope, food sovereignty, which people can write 1,000 books on.
Sure.
And so the idea for us was to try to get into communities and, again, take a snapshot of what was going on. Those relationships would have taken me, as a non-native, decades to be able to develop. But it was because of the work of A-dae and her cohorts that we were able to just jump into communities with the trust that a filmmaker needs. But at the same time, and this is essential, you know, the very first documentary ever made was called Nanook of the North. It was made by an Anglo-American filmmaker, by all accounts, you know, in consultation with the community. That said, it undoubtedly started an industry where people with privilege would fly into communities, exotic communities around the world, and tell their stories to the point where Indigenous kids all around the world tend to learn about Indigenous topics from films made by non-Indigenous people. So that said, there isn't a market for non-natives to make movies about natives. In this case, we didn't think that there would be any sort of commercial success. We made the film for Indian country, and because of that, it was really A-dae and her team that drove the access. And they told us every step of the way when we were doing well and when we were making mistakes.
That's great.
And without that, the movie would have stunk.
But now you're on Netflix.
I would just add.
Go ahead.
I mean, it was rough. It was rough. I think Sanjay has more Indian women in this universe that are sideways looking at him.
Yeah, there's a certain type of really wise, really important Native American woman that no matter what I said, I would rub them the wrong way.
Yes, absolutely.
Didn't matter.
Yes. And for us at First Nations, it was a risk. But if you notice, like, one of the most beautiful parts of this film is the water scenes. We would have had a hell of a time getting somebody to give us enough money to get one of those cameras. Those cameras alone cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And really, to break into the film industry and documentary movies, you need to be established. You need to have connections. You need to have people who are gonna. Documentary filmmaking is really, really hard. And quite frankly, there's very few Native directors who have that connection and get one of those cameras, which Sanjay has his own story about that camera.
Yeah, we lost it.
You lost it? Oh, no.
In that river.
Oh, it's tragic. Well, let's get deeper into this subject. Why, how can there be more Native filmmakers who can tell their own stories?
I mean, it's the catch-22. How many people here make documentaries or have made documentaries? Just a handful.
That's
like,
great.
You spend 90% of your time trying to raise money. It's like this film cost low seven figures.
Wow.
It's crazy because it's not like I took home that much. It's like I made mid five figures in 2 years on this film.
Wow.
And the rest of it was spent, on crew, on travel, on production, post-production facilities, etc. You need to have worked in philanthropy and have a network if you even want to tell the story. So the right people to tell the stories aren't usually the ones to tell the stories.
Yeah.
I'm not the right person for this movie. I just happened to be somebody who was willing to make fewer mistakes than most people in my demographic probably would have made. So there's a huge barrier to entry, and it relies on philanthropy, trusting people who aren't the same old
Yeah.
voices. I'm in some ways the same old voice, in some ways not. In the ways that I am, it's because I've been doing human rights work. I knew the whole grant making machinery. I knew how to shake the hands and et cetera. I knew how to get into the rooms.
Yeah.
The right people often don't get into those rooms.
Yeah.
But that said, every single movie I've made, has always been about people getting a seat that they rightfully deserved at the table.
Absolutely, absolutely. Go
And
ahead.
the documentary film world is really a reflection of, and I said this if you were in the panel, like a reflection of whose stories are valued more. And if young brown women have this barrier to entry, and fewer of those stories are getting put in front of audiences like this, that just like it comes back on itself. Mm-hmm. It's just creating this never-ending cycle of valuing certain stories from a certain demographic over others.
I mean, it goes back to the previous question. This is really dumb, but again, those who make films will know. The way you get people to watch movies about this topic is you get the $45,000, $50,000 camera, and you make it look lush.
Sure.
You make it look beautiful, and not romantic, but just beautiful. And you can't do that with an iPhone. You can't excite people with a GoPro, even though like sometimes those are the best vehicles to tell the story.
Absolutely.
Those films aren't necessarily going to get the money they need to get made. So you're in this world where we think this is art. It's commerce.
Yeah.
There's art in it. It's commerce, and you try to put the art in it the best way you can.
Well, I guess that sort of leads me to my next question. You both talked about this vicious cycle of like how philanthropy doesn't want to give to these kinds of movies. How can we get philanthropy to get out of that vicious cycle so that they do change how they help folks like you tell stories that are inspiring, stories that are needed, that need to be heard?
I wish I had an answer to that. Nobody gets an opportunity to make Gather the first time around. And the more people that make good quality stories, regardless of the equipment, are going to find audiences, and hence more things will get made.
Sure.
But again, 5 years ago, I made a movie that you were very kindly supportive of called Food Chains, about farm labor in 2014. And of all the
amazing film.
All the conferences I went to, we went to dozens of conferences, there weren't any panels on Native American food systems. None whatsoever. And if I'd even thought about pitching a funder about this movie in 2011, 2012, 2013, there was no space for it. So it's literally, and I'm not just doing this to puff you up, but it's literally spaces like this that start the conversations. In 2 or 3 years, Alex's movie is going to be made. And then someone's going to go like, oh my God, can I watch another Native American food sovereignty movie? And that'll be a pillar of success.
Yeah.
And then the next marginalized topic that deserved a space 10 years ago will finally get into the conversation.
Yeah.
So these gatherings are great.
And that's a really hard question for me, because really the problem isn't funding more movies like this. The problem is that certain people and companies are accumulating the control through the wealth and deciding who gets that funding and who gets to tell their story. So I think it's not a question of asking how do we make philanthropy fund more of these films. It's more like how do we get more people to tell their stories without philanthropy? Like how do we change that whole model?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, I want to take a step back because this film was made before the pandemic, obviously, and it would be a very different film if it was made now. And I'm wondering what you're seeing with these communities. We saw at the end, where folks are now and that kind of thing. But the pandemic changed Native communities. It changed us all in so many different ways. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think, of course, the pandemic changed us all. And for me, the pandemic just accentuated what already exists. We've always had communities who are insecure. We always had people living off the food chains. When everybody was scrambling for toilet paper and for meat, sometimes that's a daily feat in some of our communities. It just happened to seep into communities that haven't experienced it before. And so the pandemic hopefully opened people's eyes to say, like, this is what the system is created to do. Just because you may not experience these daily doesn't mean that you're not in the same system. We're all in the same system. And if one community is healthy, potentially all our communities can be unhealthy. Or food insecure. And so in Indian country, where people have always lived outside of the supply chain, it was a beautiful resurgence. Like you had people saying, I'm gonna go hunting. I'm gonna go get my grandma's seeds. I'm gonna make sure my elders are okay. It was a beautiful recognition of community. But unfortunately, we saw more citations for hunting. We saw more citations for traditional gathering. We have people who are still dealing with cases during the pandemic of like illegal harvesting on their own ancestral lands. Like these are some of the issues that the pandemic didn't show us or publicly.
Yeah.
But those are, these are the pandemic showed us and gave us the opportunity to open our eyes. And so now it's time to open them. And while philanthropy in the state was saying, well, food insecure communities need to have commodities shipped from the place where there are communities to the places without, Indian country was saying, why are we shipping the food from there? Why aren't you giving us the resources so that we can create our own system that's in our own community where we can butcher our own meat and grow our own food instead of shipping chickens from Arkansas to Arizona or Nevada? I mean, and so I do think the pandemic showed us like the strength of the different models, and now it's time to open our eyes to decide which one, where are we going?
Absolutely.
Where's our food system taking us?
Yeah.
Well, so there's a couple things in there that I just want to make sure people have the context for, because they're buried in what you said, but they're deeply, deeply important things for people to understand the context of. And correct me when I go off track here, but the supply chain system was basically created to send goods from the west to the east, which is why you have great highways going east-west, but not north-south, because those highways were built literally, right next to railway tracks. Native Americans were pushed from the eastern seaboard west, 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 insofar as they could be pushed west. But the whole supply chain system has basically worked against Indian country. Natives were moved away from the big hubs, whether it was Denver, whether it was New York City. They were moved away from the railway lines, and so they're as far away from the supply chain now as you can possibly get. The other point that A-dae made is that, this country was formed as an agricultural society, and it required two things from a supply chain standpoint. It required enslaved people from Africa. Initially, Native Americans were the first enslaved, but it required a lot of land. And so one of the things that A-dae spoke about was the structural legacy of the Native American body. We've all come to learn the legacy of the African American body, policing, school to prison pipeline, et cetera, but the Native American body didn't have a value in that sense. The land had a value. And there are certain policing systems that worked against the African American body, and there are certain policing systems that work to strip natives from their access to land, and that, for the most part, is food and game. They get penalized for using their land. They get penalized for harvesting. They get penalized for fishing. And so during the pandemic, that side of law enforcement reared its ugly head in a very, very pernicious way.
It's stunning to me. One of the folks in the film said something about this burden of being Indigenous to continue to tell the story, to make sure that folks understand it is a burden.
Yeah, we talk about that line in the film all the time. When I think about that line, I equate it to like going to the grocery store. Like when you walk down the cereal aisle, like we all have our favorite cereal and you choose the one you want, or you can choose a different one. But when you're an Indigenous person, you are born into your choice. Like there's no grocery aisle. There's no different amounts of cereal. You're raised on blue corn mush, or you're raised on acorn, or you're raised on buffalo meat. Like you are born into a system which you are meant to steward. And so he says it's a burden. I think it's a blessing and a curse, because it's always there.
Sure.
But and so you approach the world differently. Like you don't think of your choices like in agriculture. Like you can choose to be you can choose to be a permaculturalist. You can choose to be an organic farmer. You can choose to be a regenerative farmer. when you're born in Cochiti, you're a Cochiti farmer, and you have that legacy that you have to honor. It's not picking and choosing processes and people and systems. You have a system that you have inherited that you have to protect.
Absolutely. Sanjay, you know, this film has been shown all over now. It's been getting a lot of attention. I'm wondering what's the sort of surprising things that you've heard about it as the filmmaker. What were the questions that most people had? What were the most shocking things that people asked about it?
Well, you know, we finished the film in March of 2020, and it was released digitally in September of 2020. And I think the non-native interest was really, I hate to even use this word, catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd. People who didn't really believe or could form an image of that horrific legacy of how the African American body was policed could see that, you know, in color. And people began to realize or understand that there was an obverse and reverse to that coin. And this is what I just spoke about. You needed the body to harvest the land. But that land wasn't wild. That land was incredibly productive, incredibly well-stewarded land that was populated by communities that had always been there. You needed to remove those communities. I mean, the Eastern Seaboard wasn't wild. It was a fully interlaced system of very well-stewarded farms. And 1763, quick history lesson, the farmers on the East Coast wanted to push west of the Appalachian Mountains. And to do so, they needed the military support of the British. They needed their guns. They needed to forcibly displace natives west of the Appalachian Mountains from their land because they'd already destroyed, they'd monocropped the lands of the Eastern Seaboard. So for the first time in 10,000 years, within 100 years, American European farmers had destroyed a fully functioning agricultural system. They say that the British instituted the Stamp Act to forbid the Western movement of American farmers. The first thing that the Continental Congress did was enact the Northwest Ordinance, which allowed people to have the military support to push into Indiana and Ohio. So that forcible displacement of land for American farming has been the equal part of the American story as the importation of human beings.
Yeah.
And we're just on the surface of exploring the legacy of that land theft and what it means to us. It's obviously performative to say, you know, in front of corporate boards, oh, we're having this board meeting on such and such land. You know, it's a much deeper, much darker reckoning that we have to have. And it was
Absolutely.
really those moments that I think created a sense of interest in these very humble stories that have nothing to do with politics, but have everything to do with where we found ourselves as a country in terms of the environmental and social and political predicaments we're in.
Absolutely. You brought up a very important word, reckoning. Are we on the cusp of a reckoning to make sure that Native folks get their land back, that they get what they are owed?
Yeah, well, when I think about this question, I always pause, you know, because the way we think about history is very linear, and there's points that are measured by one's lifetime. But when we're talking about indigenous people, like we're in here, we will be here, we have been here. And so when we think about a reckoning, like it's always happening. I see more indigenous people getting their land back. I see more indigenous people advocating for land back. I see more indigenous people, but you know, we have always been there. We've always had these very talented people who have navigated these very complicated systems. And I think I would say there's a reckoning, and I don't know if it's what we're owed. I think we are still on that path to steward our lands the way our ancestors taught us to steward that lands. And whether or not that is recognized as a process, we will continue to do that regardless of what system we have to operate on. And so it's like we're almost on a whole different plane.
Sure.
When we're talking, because you know what, we're older than the American system. We're older than the Mexican system that predated the American. We're older than the Spanish system that predated Mexico. Like our creation stories take us back to the beginning. And so those are our time frames. Those are what we're looking at. And we don't measure times in seasons or years or lifetimes. We measure things by generations. And so when we look at it like that, it's less about what is old just in American history. This is about like universal connection that can never be broken beyond just this American idea of like reckoning and legal like responses. I think that's, it goes much deeper than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sanjay, is there anything different you would have done looking back, you know, when you started this film? I mean, you obviously put yourself with the right people to get you where you needed to go to tell these really interesting stories, but I'm wondering if there was anything you would have done differently for the filmmakers in the audience. Again, advice on how they can approach these stories.
We got so lucky, like, to be there on the day that Elsie won. And, you know, Nephi, it's not really depicted in the film, but we had to wait more than a year from the second to last time we filmed Nephi till when his cafe opened in January of 2020. And then, of course, it shut down in March 2020, and
Sure.
it's reopened again. So I can't say that. I think anything that's poorly done in the movie is obviously my fault. It's all my fault. And anything that happened that's good in the movie was simply providence. It was not A-dae, but it was providence. It was A-dae.
He did tell me you'd be Laurel and Hardy on stage, so. A-dae, what, you know, your daughter's here, and there are so many young people who are looking for something to believe in, for something to hang on to, especially during these times. It's a really terrible time in the world for multiple reasons, not just the pandemic. And I wonder what you hope she learns from this film and the films that are being made after it.
Well, for my daughter in particular, like she sees me on talking about the film, and she sees me at work, and there are so many mistakes we're making just as a generation, because you know we've operated in a place where they're telling us like accumulation of wealth is the measure of success, where getting a PhD is going to make you valuable. And you know, unfortunately to me, that creates all these mistakes that we as in a generation are making, because we're hyper individualized. We're hyper concerned with our own life, and the systems support that because we have bills to pay, because we have things to buy. And to me, it's creating all these mistakes. And what I hope the younger generation recognizes is that they are mistakes, that you don't have to operate in the system that I grew up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so for my young people, like, we can't wait for you to grow up. We need your minds. And please don't judge us too harshly, like in the future.
That's something we should all be like reminding ourselves. Like we're only starting to do our best as this generation, and I hope that young people will forgive us for the mistakes that we've made all over. I want to turn to questions because this has been such an engaged audience, and thank you all for sticking around. I think this has been such a wonderful. Thank you. So wonderful to have you both here. You both traveled very far, so I want to make sure that people from the audience have a chance to ask you questions. Sure, go ahead, sir.
It goes back to something that A-dae said about prior to the American system, prior to the Mexico system, prior to the Spanish, really going back to the beginning of time, tells me there's been a lot of adaptation along the way to get from there to here. How do you see that in relation to climate change?
Thank you. There's a Hopi story. So Hopis are Pueblos. I'm Pueblo. And there's a story about our seeds. And our seeds, the Hopis and the Pueblo people landed in the Southwest, very dry. My people come from high deserts, probably 7 inches of water on a really, really, really good year. And we always got questions like, why would you live in a desert? Why would you end up there? And the answer from our grandparents is always, because it makes us value that one drop of water, because it creates a society that learns about frugalness, that learns about not consuming too much. And it may not make sense when everybody can go to the store and go to the movies and drink whatever they want at any time or order it on a cell phone, but at some time in our community's life, this is gonna make sense. And that is like more truth to me now than it was in 1980. And so I think there's value in what each community brings as like a culture and a tradition, and it may not make sense at that time, but it'll make sense in the future. And if we just have to create the connections where those stories can be told and the people can learn those intergenerational connections. And so when I think about climate change, like to me it's going back to beginning, like what are those stories? Like why do we have those seeds?
Absolutely, thank you. Let me go back here to the back. Can you speak up, use your big voice?
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the most important lessons about growing up in an indigenous community, and I go back to the example of like the cereal aisle, when you are born into a community, that means like it's not just you making that choice of cereal, that you have people around you that have also input into that choice. And when you think about sending our kids off, like the whole idea, and I'm very educated, like overeducated, but when we send our kids off and say like, you're gonna be a valuable member of society if you get your PhD and you have a good job, that separates them from community. And so to me, the most valuable thing we can do is create education systems where they're surrounded by community and we value each other. And to me, that's what keeps you connected. The average lifespan, I think, is like 52, so technically I'm like elder status right now.
No, not at all.
Thank you very much for your information about agriculture.
Again, big voice so everyone can hear.
Thank you very much for your information on the agricultural history. Sounds very well informed, and you seem very committed to this whole milieu. Now I'm a consumer, and I thought there were so many compelling things in the movie. You know, I look around, I see Driscoll's is up here. Is Driscoll's a really good food source? Is my bison that I get at my HEB going to be of good quality and that have the same characteristics as what the young woman spoke about in her presentation? And how does that play in for the rest of the world or consumers like me who don't grow their own food except for a small garden in the backyard?
It's a great question, you know, and I would, this will sound smart, but I'm just repeating what somebody told me. There's been a misnomer, I think, in the food industry, in the food movement, that we can make a difference by being consumers. We can't make any difference at all. It's like there's 2 kinds of olive oil, there's like 10 kinds of tomatoes or whatever. You can make a difference by being a citizen. That's what this country affords us. I mean, it's got great land, there's great science, but it's like change doesn't happen by picking and choosing from a limited set of options. It comes, in the case of Gather, from understanding the Native communities around us, what their policy platforms are, beginning to understand how their policy platforms have a much longer horizon than we could ever imagine, and understanding how to support those. Because in that sense, we're not just making the quick choice, and it's the easy choice in one sense of which type of food to buy. It's more like which rivers out there do we need to protect? You know, which biomes do we need to really, really fight for? And I don't know that. You know, a movie's not going to tell me that. A book's not going to tell me that. But going to the communities that see themselves and understand the responsibility as stewards of the land that I've passively taken, continue to keep for myself, I think is a way to be a better citizen of not just the United States, but maybe a better citizen of Turtle Island. That's what I've learned as a non-native. I'm sure there's probably a much better answer, but that's just my experience.
And I would just say, I think you're asking all the right questions. Like, yes, good questions. But we do have, just in our language, like consumer and producer, like that supports a certain approach to how you look at the world.
I mean, we've been taught that.
Yeah,
We've been
it's
taught
like
to look at things that way.
It's taught that things are commodified, that you can buy things, and that, you know, in this system that we operate where everything can be bought, land can be bought, people can be bought, water can be bought. And, you know, if we really want to make a change, like, first we got to change all those words, and then hopefully it'll change the way we think, and hopefully it'll change the way we interact with one another. And so I'm always pausing when someone asks me a question, because we have to interrogate the language and the assumptions that we carry with us on a daily basis, like being a consumer, like being a producer.
I mean, you're both. You've got a garden.
I'm of Native heritage, and so I espouse a lot of Native concepts. You know, like raising my children, it was my job to punish them and to teach them. And I've got 2 young granddaughters that I watch a lot, so I worry about their future like a lot of people do. So.
The semantics here are so important. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I didn't mention at the beginning of this, I've had a long relationship with A-dae that has started, because I wanted to learn more. I had some issues, and the semantics about this, you've taught me so much, because it really is important how we speak about this. We try to, at Food Tank, to talk about things like eaters instead of consumers, because we all eat, right? And I know there are other questions from the audience. We'll go over time, so don't worry, I'll get to all of you. But I think the political part of this is very interesting, and that Sanjay brought up. Do we need more Native folks running for office so that we can talk about policy for future generations instead of policy for the next 4 years?
Politics. Oh my gosh, I avoid this topic at all costs.
A-dae is going to announce that she's starting an exploratory committee for California State Senate.
Right on, right?
It's controlled, right? When you have a 2-party system where, you know, it's rooted in who can run for office, and who, even though we say, like, okay, we need to make the system more diverse, but you're basically creating a system where you're bringing in the same kind of thought, just with like darker tones. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And so we need to really like think about the whole system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right.
Hi, Danny. Thanks to the panel. My question is always, so when I'm talking with my Caucasian friends, and they're truly empathetic about the work I do in media and food and whatnot, one of the concepts that I struggle with, and I was thinking that while watching the film, is the word culture. Culture means something real specific to people of color, but trying to articulate to them how deep-rooted that is for people of color, depending on which group they're y'all message gather so that you're making sure that that everyone understands that this is not just a documentary on a group of people, that the cultural inferences are what is causing people to get disenfranchised? Sorry, that was my question.
That that's a question that's way above my pay grade. But what I tell people is, like, we all came from someplace, and wherever that first ancestral memory was from, with the exception of Sephardic Jewish people, those communities were probably there for thousands of years. I mean, we're not really that nomadic. I mean, it's only been the last few hundred that we could actually get on a boat and go, like, as a massive amount of people, like thousands and tens of thousands, could go like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 miles. So chances are, like, if you were born above the Arctic Circle and you couldn't digest high amounts of fat, you would die and you wouldn't pass on your genes. So that's to infer that our genes are very highly specified for particular foods and particular food environments. And this is where the culture comes in. Most of us, myself included, I'm first generation. When I asked my mother, who's in her 80s, if she could remember what was in her grandmother's pantry, the variety of grains, the variety of oils and spices bears no resemblance to my concept of modern East Indian food. We carried our connection with our land in our foods. We carried that spirituality, the religion, the creation story in that relationship. When you lose that ancestral relationship with the foods of your heritage, you lose so much. And I mean, that's what I learned from a lot of the communities that A-dae took me into. I realized how much I was missing, but I also realized what I still had. And if you go into anybody's family history, whether they're settlers, whether they were brought here against their will, whether they're first-generation immigrants, etc., there's a story in there. And the more secure they are as people, I found, the more connected they already are to those stories, and how that story from the beginning of their ancestry has persisted. I mean, that's my really obtuse way of just trying to understand the depth of that question. It's a great question.
And in Hawaii, my husband's half Hawaiian, they say when they want to discuss something, even if it's like going to be really crunchy, they say, let's talk story. Because really at some point in the way we do things in the world, like, we became disattached from our stories, just like we got disattached from our lands, just like we're getting disattached from our foods. And we've become these, like, nutrient counting, calorie counting, like, I don't know, machines.
Podcast listening.
Yes, so, like, at some point, we are, like, we have to recognize we are, like, living, breathing stories that started when the stars started and will end when the stars end. And that's really hard for a lot of people in a culture where it dilutes you to the most, like, measurable unit.
Dollars.
Yeah.
Dollars. That's everybody's story, and it's like, it's no fault of ours, but it's so easy to reinvent yourself and to understand yourself if you separate yourself from that idea that you're you've got a dollar figure attached to your worth.
And I mean, the people who do the bean counting, we need you, yes, but we need more people who think about stars and stories and who are willing to approach the world and say, talk story. Like, we shouldn't punish people for being big thinkers. We shouldn't punish people for telling their stories and not knowing what unit of measure that we're talking about. Like, how many carbon units are these communities sequestering? I don't know, but you have to listen to their story. And some communities, society has to do the work, not like the people in order to get into these rooms coming with that measurement mentality in the beginning, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Other questions right here?
it's a great question. You know, I think I do myself a little bit of injustice by throwing myself into the pile of non-natives. Like, I come from India, and I spent a lot of time on Navajo making a running movie, and we have clans, and you know, I felt so many similarities, and I understood, you know, that like my only asset as a non-native filmmaker is to listen and to let the people and their own land tell the stories to us. And so I was talking to Alex. Alex asked me, the Inuit filmmaker, she was asking me, like, how did you pick the characters? And I said, we did it really, really superficially because it's a visual medium. We knew that they were all going to be stellar activists and pillars of their community because A-dae was introducing us. But we wanted to be with the people who had the deepest story in their eyes, the deepest story in their faces, so that they would speak through the camera to the audience member. And the camera would be the filter, not the filmmaker. And the audience would get out of it whatever they saw and whatever they felt. So in a nutshell, like when we spent time, the first time we spent time with Twyla, we were just wandering through the Apacheria with her. And I was telling, you know, the producer that was with us, Tanya, telling Tanya, like, I could watch Twyla do this all day. And yeah, and like when we first met the Ancestral Guard kids, I was like, these are like the kids from that 80s movie Stand By Me. They don't know what they're doing. And it's so interesting. I said, we could film them all day. So the process was like with the Ancestral Guard saying, what do you want us to film? And we would do that. Twyla, what do you want us to film? I have no preconceived notions of what your story is. You tell us what you want us to film. And as they would get comfortable with us and as they would get comfortable with the camera, more and more and more would come out. So it was really a process of trying to feel a sense of emotion that they were projecting, and as a director, getting them to give us more and more and more of that, so it would build through the movie. There's no real story and gather. Like, there's nothing that you could say, like, these are the 10 things that I've learned. We tried to just make it, we just tried to allow the viewer to feel whether we could present it well or not, but to feel what we did when we were there with the characters. And in some cases, we didn't show enough. Like, in some cases, I think if I was Native, we would have taken the movie in a completely different direction. And that's the limitation. But again, like, to finally wrap up the answer, my goal in this was to make as few mistakes as I possibly could. And so, like, if we came at the end of this and, like, I didn't, like, ruin too many of A-dae's friendships, then it would be a success.
That's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you all so much, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much.